let's get started for today. This is our last remote session. So starting from next week on, we'll be doing the sort of the hybridy format. So for people who are taking the course remotely, I'm not going to be recording the class session myself. Everything will be done through the Echo 360. So you should be able to live stream the class through Echo 360, and the classroom recordings should be available via Echo 360. And for people who are coming in either one or both days, if you're coming in one day, make sure you really do just come in the one day. We're going to have assigned seating charts, so we can't have people sort of flipping it. If you want to try to come in both days, let me know. I might be able to squeeze that in with the number of people I can fit into a room at a time if anything has changed with your plans. And then the other day you can live stream it using Echo 360. And for people who are coming in both days, come in both days. Nothing what you'd expect. We'll still have the daily assignments be due prior to the class session, whether you're taking the class remotely, face-to-face, or whatever. However you're doing it, make sure those daily assignments get turned in before we start class. I think that's it for business. Any questions about anything with this hybrid switch that we'll doing? So good question about it's a good question. My hope at least is that you should be able to see the board from the Echo 360 recordings. So for people who are watching it remotely, this might take me a couple days to get them to fix it. So I ask you to bear with me if there's some tech issues the first couple days. I'll try to get them sorted out as quickly as I can. But the ideal is going to be you should see as part of the Echo 360 broadcast whiteboard. It'll be a digital one, but you should see the digital whiteboard as part of the broadcast. At least that's how it's supposed to work anyway. See if it actually works that way, but that's at least how it's supposed to work. Good. Any others? All right. Next week we'll also talk about the first paper draft as well. That we'll also go over that a little bit in that context too. All right. So if no one has any other questions about that, today we're actually going to get completely caught up. I think it's actually going to happen. We're going to basically do a big picture summary of everything that we've talked about up to this point. That's the goal. And sort of see the new position that we've arrived at. Basically, think of this as basically through the Enlightenment. Right? We sort of have gone up through the Enlightenment. So what new position are we at? Again, remember the overall project that Taylor has laid out. He wants to know why was it functionally impossible for people not to believe in God in 1500, and why is it quite easy for us to not believe in God now? Again, that's not to say that everyone does not believe in God, right? But that it's a conceptual possibility that all of us can wrap our heads around, whether we are believers or not believers. So what's changed? And we're going to start to see the answer today. We're moving toward this thing that Taylor calls exclusive humanism. And this is the view that human beings are adequate to explain human flourishing, and flourishing consists in just living a human life. So we're going to start to see the development of this. It's not going to emerge, what we're going to talk about today, this sort of neo-Stoic self. It's a kind of humanism, but it's a Christian humanism still. But it's sort of going to be on the way, at least with hindsight, we can say it's going to be on the way to the exclusive humanism that's going to emerge in the 1800s. So that's going to be our trajectory. We're going to do a real quick review of what we've been talking about, and then we're going to dive pretty hard into this idea of neo-Stoicism and what new conception of humanity it's inaugurating. My guess is all of you simultaneously kind of see yourself as in the way that neo-Stoics are describing, and you kind of are really suspicious of neo-Stoicism. Both of those are going to turn out to be true. That's indeed the condition of modernity itself, actually. Modernity itself, everyone kind of thinks this way, and everyone kind of doesn't like thinking this way, too. That is what's going to lead to, in the 1800s, things like romanticism as a reaction against what we're going to talk about today. But you're all also going to recognize it. Like, at the very least, you're going to, like, know people who talk this way and see themselves in this way. That's at least the hope. And that we can contrast that with how sort of see this as a development rather than the way humans always saw themselves. That's our goal. Anyone have any sort of initial thoughts, comments, questions, anything, or should we just dive right into it? All right, let's dive right into it then. So let's remind ourselves what the Middle Ages were like. Right? So what we're going to get today is a new conception of self. Now, again, this isn't exactly a philosophical theory. At least that's Taylor's claim. I mean, there are philosophers who theorize on the basis of this. We're particularly talking about Descartes a lot today. But this isn't so much a theory as it's something more fundamental than that. It's sort of a way of seeing and thinking about what it is that you are. How do you relate to all the parts of yourself? How do you relate to the world, to your culture, right? And you can formulate theories and philosophies on the basis of that kind of understanding, and people necessarily will. But this is sort of prior to philosophy in some respects. This is sort of the foundation from which people philosophize. So in the Middle Ages, right, Taylor described this what he's trying to describe as kind of a porous sense of self. So this is where the way you understand yourself is as embedded in a world of meanings that you're sort of vulnerable and open to. And that's a sense of porous, right? That the world can kind of sneak in on you. And this is vulnerable in two senses, both in a negative sense of vulnerable, right, where you're like subject to malign influences, but also in a positive sense that you can sort of be healed and helped by these meanings. And as part of this sort of conception of self, right, so what we would call, we would be now tempted to call religion, which no one would have called this at the time, is something that's fundamentally communal. The thing that's going to get saved isn't so much you, or at least you're only going to indirectly going to get saved. What's going to get saved is the community, right? Or maybe humanity as a whole. So again, we're in a Christian time, right? So who has Christ died to redeem? He hasn't died to redeem you. He's died to redeem humans. Now, this might seem like a small difference, right? Because you're one of the humans, right? You are a human being too, right? So you're included, right? But the thrust of the salvation is collective. And that this is carried forth in the way that the community engages in religious practices, engages in religious rituals, right? These are communal things. They're not oriented toward you. When you go to church maybe once a year or twice a year, and the priest is spouting a whole bunch of Latin, he's not exactly spouting it for your benefit, but you being there is an important part. If you weren't there to witness him spouting it, it wouldn't work. Right, so sort of you have this idea of kind of complementariness that Taylor sort of suggests, right? That there are different classes, but the classes all need to be there, and you can't get rid of some of them and have the system still work, right? You need priests, you need monks, you need warriors, you need kings, and you need peasants, and you need merchants, and you need all of these different classes. Now, it's hierarchical. Some are still better than others, but all of them are needed, and all of them have a place. And there's sort of ideally at least a way for you to be part of your community, part of the church, however you're doing it. Yeah, and so then we can also expand this a little bit. If you're more philosophically inclined, you also know some of the sort of like ethical theories, right? So maybe you know some you probably don't know Plato or Aristotle, but you know people who are influenced at least by Plato and Aristotle. Maybe you know St. Augustine or Aquinas a little bit. Maybe you know some Stoicism, actually, some ancient Stoicism a little bit, because that was something that people would have still had some access to. So if you know all of these things, you also are sort of like conceptualizing this sort of like harmony that we're talking about here, the harmony of the classes, as a more general kind of harmony governing the entire universe in some sense. You understand your goal in life is to be harmonious with yourself, right? So all the parts of yourself are in agreement. Your desire agrees with what you think is right, agrees with what's actually right. Right? So you're harmonious in that sense. You don't need to be self-controlled. You don't need to be at war with yourself or constantly fighting yourself. Also, you should be in kind of a harmony with your community, all the classes and the parts of the community, in agreement with one another, working together to accomplish the same thing. You see yourself as in sort of unified, or in some sense, or at least the goal at least is to be unified, harmonious with the entire cosmos, right? That you have a place within the cosmos where you belong as a human being, and you need to do that, right? And then you'll let the stars do what the stars do. You'll let the planets do what the planets do. You'll let the weather do what the weather does, right? But you're going to do your place in this sort of cosmic harmony. And then again, ultimately, all of this is just a reflection of the transcendent God, right? So all of creation is made in the image of God, right? With maybe humanity especially made in the image of God, but not exclusively made in the image of God. Everything is in some sense an image or a reflection of the power and grandeur of God. And so by living in harmony with the whole universe, you're also living harmoniously with God. You're being inclined toward these higher eternities, these higher times. You're being inclined toward transcendence, right? And so even if you're mostly living your life secularly, in the sense of secular time, right, you still have these moments where you sort of like get a glimpse of the higher when you're living in harmony with it. All right. So that's review of sort of the Middle Ages. How we doing? Questions, thoughts, comments about any of that? All right. So we saw last couple class sessions that the various kinds of sort of reform efforts that Taylor talks about kind of break all of that, right? And the big thing that actually needs to get broken, the sort of the biggest thing that's sort of deliberately getting broken, is this actually the very sense of harmony itself. It becomes to be thought within like Luther, Calvin, and within certain Catholic circles too, that these sort of like lower speeds of religious practice, where you have people who sort of like, they're not super into it, but they do the rituals right, they say the right things, maybe they go to confession once in a while, right? Like, what people who we would think of as not particularly religious, and indeed at the time would have been said to not be particularly religious. It was thought that allowing that to happen, allowing that lower speed to exist, was a kind of like allowance of evil to exist, right? That everyone should be at the highest level, and if you're not at the highest level, you're bad, you're evil, you're contrary to God. And so what needs to be done is to in effect break these very ideas of these kind of harmonies. And this isn't just a religious kind of function, this is also kind of a political function as well, right? That we sort of are pushing in the direction of getting rid of, say, the abuse of the Pope, right? Get rid of papal corruption. And the trajectory of this is in the direction of democracy. It obviously doesn't start in the direction of democracy, right? Because you still have kings. But at first, at least, the sort of trajectory of all this, get rid of all of these hierarchies, a true citizenry of where everyone is purely equal, right? And everyone is held to sort of the highest standard. Right? Now, the highest standard has changed. It's not the same highest standard of this sort of like monastic kind of life where you've sort of given up worldly things to turn entirely toward the eternal and the divine. Right now, the highest standard is, something maybe like you think the Puritans again as a good example that we're probably more familiar with of a lot of this stuff, where it's sort of like now like a human community where everyone in the community is like striving to be moral, and not just be moral in the context of God and with the idea toward faith toward God. Right, and as a more active project rather than you just sort of passively living your life and religion being something that goes on around you. Okay, so good thoughts, questions on any of this so far? All right, all that's review. So all that's review. Now we can get basically the upshot. Why are we talking about any of this stuff? What are we getting out of this philosophically? What we're getting is a new way of conceiving the self. The old way of conceiving the self that we were just talking about no longer fits this world picture. And indeed, this happens pretty dramatically amongst the elites at the very least. In general, things start with the elites and then bleed down over time. But by relatively early on, you got Hobbes, who's not that late of a philosophical thinker. He's in the 1600s. He's already railing against the superstition of the peasants in the Middle Ages, right? And the superstitions of the peasants in his own time, even, right? And railing against the way that they're seeing themselves as being intrinsically superstitious. What should they be seeing themselves as? Isolated individuals, right? Individuals who are not intrinsically part of any community and who therefore are going to make communities via social contract theory or whatever, right? And Hobbes isn't that late. I mean, that's going to get way more pronounced as it gets later and later and bleeds to sort of more and more popular levels of culture. So what I'd like us to do today is figure out what is the new kind of self that's getting created by all of these kind of reform projects, be they the civilizing sort of political reform projects or the sort of religious reform projects, Protestant Reformation, but also movements within Catholicism too. And the sort of buzz phrase or catchword that we're going to use for this is neo-Stoicism. So My guess is most of you probably don't know that much about sort of Stoicism classic. Is that accurate? So would a little brief discussion of Stoicism be help, Stoicism original version of it or whatever, right? Before we get to the Neo-Stoics. So the Stoics, we don't need to go too deep into any of this, but I can give you just a real quick brief summary of them. They're an ancient philosophical sect. They emerged in the Hellenistic period, so sort of post what we think of as classical Greece. They are loosely inspired by Plato and Socrates, but they go in pretty dramatically different directions. What they're fundamentally about, the thing they're probably the closest to, actually, that we see in modern traditions is Buddhism, though there are important differences. But their basic sense is that, like, if you're like really think that like your happiness consists in like living in the world, you're going to be constantly disappointed because the world is, you can't control it. The world is just not under your control. And so, if you like, I'm going to like make a lot of money, great. Maybe you even make a lot of money and then something bad will happen and you'll lose all your money. Sucks to be you. Nothing you can even do about it. Like, it's not even your fault. This is just how the world is. The world is such that you don't have any control over it. Okay. What do you have control over? Well, the only thing, according to the Stoics, that you have your control over is your reaction to things. So when you lose all your money, that's not under your power, but you sort of like ripping your clothes and crying, like that's in your power. It's in your power to not be bothered by it, right? And now it's not easy, right? It's not you just snap your fingers and all of a sudden you don't cry when your kid dies, right? Right. This is a long, difficult process of attaining this kind of dispassionate standpoint. But the goal of it is such that you're no longer moved by what happens around you in the world. All you really care about is yourself and how you react to things, and this is the key to happiness. The Stoics also take from sort of Platonic Aristotelian thought, so this idea of sort of like harmony with the universe. They're kind of, if you're familiar with this term, they're basically pantheists. They think that the universe, that nature is God. So they're not really pointing exactly to anything transcendent with any of this, but they do talk about God as nature. And that we sort of need to, like, part of attaining this sort of like attitude of dispassionateness or equanimity involves sort of like recognizing the sort of cosmic providence of nature and that we're just a tiny little part of it and just going to sort of float along with it. So that's probably all we really need to know. It's this idea of sort of like being dispassionate. That's really all that's going to actually be preserved in Neo-Stoicism. Neo-Stoicism is going to be super different, but what's going to be preserved is this idea that you need to be sort of dispassionate from things. So any questions or follow-ups anyone wants to add just about the original speed of Stoicism? It's actually a super big deal. Stoicism is probably the second most important philosophy in ancient Rome after Platonism. And there's actually in the very early days of the Christian church, there's a real push and pull about whether or not Christianity should be interpreted in Platonic terms or in Stoic terms. Platonism wins overall, and so generally speaking, you don't get a lot of like Christianized Stoic stuff until Neo-Stoics show up. But at least in the original days, sort of the Platonic reading of Christianity kind of wins philosophically through figures like St. Augustine and Origen and a lot of the Eastern fathers. But for a time, at least, there was some people within Christianity wanted to sort of read Christianity in Stoic terms. The problem is, right, like it's hard to read Christ dying on the cross and crying out in pain as a Stoic reaction, right? I mean, it seems as if Christianity has a kind of like passionate component of being embodied, being vulnerable to the universe that Stoicism just didn't really seem to fit with, people thought. And so that's why things went more in the kind of Platonic philosophical direction. Yeah, go ahead, Magnus.
So I guess if Platonism ended up sort of winning the influence battle for Christianity, does the Christian notion of like an embedded self sort of derive from that idea of like participating in the one kind of with Plato?
That's how it tends to get described. Yeah, you start getting a lot of participation language, but now we're not participating in forms. We're participating in some sense with God, usually through Christ. So like in a lot of the Eastern fathers, you straight up, they use the word metekein. like with Christ, actually, right? Like you sort of like participate with God the Father through by participating in the life of Christ and the Church of Christ.
Okay.
Yeah, and it also gets used to sort of characterize how sort of how God becomes embodied too, as a kind of like participating in himself. And it's super weird, but yeah, like, but that does become kind of the framework. Even though again, they're not like yes, we're saying the same thing as that pagan guy Plato was saying. Like they wouldn't say that usually, but like yeah, in terms of like the way of understanding itself, that's kind of the philosophical scholarly apparatus that the early church uses to sort of explain itself both to the Romans, but also to itself, what's going on within it too. Same thing happens within Judaism as well, by the way. Around the same time, a lot of Jewish thinkers are using a Platonic philosophy to sort of like it's not like transform or anything. Like they wouldn't say they were changing anything, but using it to sort of like help elucidate what they thought was really going on within their tradition. All right. So that good for Stoicism Classic? All right, now let's get the new model of Stoicism. All right, let's get the Neo-Stoics in here. Okay, the only piece of Stoicism that gets preserved in this is this dispassionateness. That's the thing that gets preserved. But what's dispassionate has changed. What's dispassionate is reason. So we're going to get really a radically different conception of reason than existed within the ancient world. So let's start with the sort of founder of this movement, and then we'll first going to just do the founder of the movement and just he wasn't really a philosopher. We'll talk about what he was actually. It's really interesting what he is. But then we'll sort of talk about how this becomes kind of a philosophy from it. So this begins with a guy named Lipsius. He's sort of the founder of all of this. And he's, like I said, not a philosopher. What is he? He's actually a military strategist. What he's predominantly known for is his manuals about how to modernize the military. How can we sort of transition from the kind of military that existed in the Middle Ages, where we have this sort of like warrior noble class, basically. And that's what they do, is be a warrior. And now we have more basically like peasant armies armed with guns. How do we turn this sort of random disorganized group of peasants into a group of people who are going to stand in a straight line and shoot at each other, right? Because that's not easy to do. I mean, it's not like you're like ducking behind cover either, right? Like it's literally like people like standing in line shooting at one another, right? How can we discipline them to do this? And so what Lipsius really emphasizes indeed is this ideal of a kind of discipline and a kind of obedience. Now, okay, discipline and obedience toward what? Well, toward lots of different things. We can say discipline and obedience to God. Right? Or, and this sort of comes to the same thing in him, interestingly, discipline or obedience to reason. And let's just leave it as a question mark, just how similar or the same these two things are supposed to be in him. Certainly, they're at the very least related. Proper reason is being in accordance with what God wants. So there's, in that sense, still a connection between these things. But it's also possible, I should make this actually a lowercase r, right? He's also talking about your reason, right? Reason as a kind of individual thing too, right? If you know Kant, this isn't Kant, but it's on the way to Kant, right? So not the same thing, but getting there. It's pushing in that direction at least. Okay. So what do we do then? Why are we calling this a kind of stoicism? Well, it's stoicism because you're going to need to act in the face of the hardships of life. Right? And he talks about people other than soldiers. He's intending this more as a sort of a general account of the world. And it has enormous influence, actually. People are reading Lipsius all over the place. But he's sort of like, it's going to be helpful maybe to think of this specifically from the standpoint of a soldier. Actually, it might be a helpful way of just almost like thinking about the problem is and what that's trying to be solved here. But the way to do so is to not be moved by these hardships, to be dispassionate. And this is this idea of dispassionate rationality, right? The rationality that's not supposed to get angry, it's not supposed to get sad, it's not supposed to let any of that stuff affect it. And what's the reason doing? Reason's just sitting back behind the scenes, sort of coolly stroking its beard, because of course it has a beard, right? And being like, yes, this is the thing that ought to be done, right? Now, this is also a Christian philosophy. So it's Christian Stoicism. Think of it Stoicism plus Christianity in a really weird version of both of them. But what do you need to do? The way you need to act in the face of the hardships of life is you need to strive against evil, try to promote the good. Where evil is sort of synonymous with disorder. And good is associated with order, right? So this is intimately connected with the kind of civilizing projects we talked about last time. Really, you almost maybe couldn't do the civilizing projects without something like this kind of neo-Stoic philosophy. You sort of need it. You need to sort of equate evil, disorder, good, order. Okay? And so you have to act to do these things, but you're not moved, or you're not bothered by anything in the course of your actions. It doesn't bother you. You let it wash off of you, right? So you're working to do the good, but you're not like getting upset by it, right? If things aren't going the way that you want, again, this is an ideal, obviously, right? But if things aren't working out the way you want, right? So be it, you're still going to keep working anyway. But you also have confidence that things can be transformed in this way to line up with the public good. You can and will ultimately, at the end of the road, be successful. And again, what guarantees this, what ensures this, is God. Right? God's sort of sort of the insurance policy of this, right? Or the justification of this confidence that you have, right? Because ultimately, like what's reasonable and what God wants, they're one and the same thing. So again, you get some like hint of that sort of old Stoic harmony, but notice how it's been radically transformed, right? We're not trying to live in harmony with nature. We're trying to transform nature to match our reason. Right? There is no harmony to be found. If you want to put, if any of you are Warhammer fans, there is only war. Right? There is no peace. There is nothing but war. I mean, right? There is nothing but the struggle to impose order upon a world that by its nature does not admit of it, though God made it to fit together if only we would force it into the right shape. So we got a, for the Warhammer fans out there. Right? Now, this isn't to say that the universe or nature is bad. The universe or nature is basically a mechanism that needs us to sort of fix it or wind it up properly. Right? Like we can almost think of us that we're the mechanics of the world that God has created. right? If left to its own devices, everything is going to become chaos, disorder. We need to do our part as sort of reason in alignment with the will of God to put things in the right direction, in the right place. So how are people doing so far? All this good? Right. And the way you do this is by becoming disciplined yourself, right? So then most of what Lipsius does is super practical, actually. It's like literally like what you should do with soldiers under your command is just drill them endlessly until it is just pure automatic behavior that they hold their gun at such and such an angle and point it the right direction. Like drill it, drill it, drill it, drill it. That's how we sort of attain this within ourselves. We sort of discipline ourselves via drilling and constant practice, breaking things into really small little parts. Like this Lipsius is one of the first people who sort of like breaks down like first you step when you're marching, first you step with your left leg, then you step with your right leg, and over till we're all marching exactly the same way. Like that we sort of break things into these individual steps, practice until we have mastered ourselves and there's nothing sort of out of alignment with ourselves. Magnus, go ahead. I see your. By the way, I can't always see all of you when I'm on the whiteboard, so you can unmute yourself too. Don't worry about it. Don't hesitate.
Okay. So to Lipsius, would it be like, I guess, disordered, to use his words, to like not act in this way? So like if you're trying to pursue the good,
right,
which I think he would say is a very like is a positive thing, but
sure.
you do it in a disordered way, is that then overall bad still, or?
Well, yeah, it's like think of it like it would be like someone like trying to fix a machine by smashing it with a hammer, right? Like maybe their intentions are good, but we're not caught yet. We don't care about your intentions, right?
Yeah.
Like what we care about is like fixing the machine, right? We care about the civilizing project.
Okay, gotcha.
And so probably they would have thought there was something perverse about the sort of like, and maybe probably in fact they would have been like, yeah, this is like papistry or something, like sort of the Catholic way of doing things, or you're acting all passionate and stuff. But like, the biggest picture is that like in making yourself the kind of person, your goal is to become the kind of person who can lead the kind of society you're trying to create. So if the good is an ordered society, you have to make yourself into an ordered person so that you can lead all those people who haven't disciplined themselves yet. And this goes hand in hand with some of Luther and Calvinist stuff too, right? Like Luther and Calvin are both insistent that what the elect should be doing is dispassionately ruling society so that all those people who are going to hell don't at least have like a decent human life before they end there. So they're at least not murdering each other in the streets or whatever, right? They're still going to hell, right? They're still not the elect, right? But that it's sort of the duty of, and the elect don't need to be ruled because they rule themselves, right? But it's their duty as these people who have been self-ordered then to organize their society as sort of best as possible, or as best as one can. Someone else in the chat, is this connected with this idea of seeing God as sort of the clockmaker? We're not there yet, but we're on the way. We're well, God's not merely a clockmaker yet, at least, but he is a clockmaker, perhaps amongst other things that he's doing too. And this goes along with the new physics, right? So the new sort of Newtonian, or not Newton yet really, but the Galilean physics that way more easily make the cosmos make sense as a kind of mechanism. And so God is putting it in motion. This is all still perfectly compatible with maybe God needing to work within me for me to attain this order, though. So I can still say that like I can't order myself. God needs to order me, even though it sort of looks like I'm ordering myself, right? Because I'm the one who's doing all this like drilling, disciplining behaviors. But it's really God working within me that does everything. I can still at least pay a little sort of lip service to that. That's what's going to fully go away when we get to deism. God is just the pure clockmaker God. God just sets the universe in motion and then steps back and lets it go. So Tyler, I hope that was helpful there. Yeah, the claim, yeah, sometimes you might have to smack the machine around a little bit. I can see the point, right? Sometimes you might have, slap the monitor or whatever to get it to start working, right? And you can maybe even fit that in, right? That there's going to be some people who are resistant to uh, this new order, so we're going to have to use more violent means to get them in line. The ideal is everyone will be disciplining themselves, but in practice, right, if you're an officer in a 16th century Prussian, or Prussian, probably wasn't Prussian yet, but in a 16th century French army, in practice, what you're going to do a lot is slap around your drunken, disorderly, peasant soldiers, right? So like a little like violence will be part of this. Or say if we're colonizing North America, then yeah, we're going to wipe out all those people who can't be disciplined. Or if we're enslaving people in Africa, yeah, so like violence is still part of the story, but it's sort of like an unnecessary part of the story if only everyone would just control themselves. They can't, but if everyone could. Let's see. And so then we have one last question here in the chat that I want to get through. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so our the reason is sort of given to us by God in some sense, and so that's sort of why we have this vocation of being sort of mechanics of the world. Again, it's not yet Kant, but it's on the way to Kant. You can sort of see Kant from where we're standing at this point. Yeah, and partially this also goes hand in hand again with our abilities. The thing that Descartes is going to emphasize is mathematics, and this is sort of the preeminent science during this time, right? And the fact that the universe has this sort of like mathematical structure to it, according to the new science, is just more proof that we're in a position to understand its operations and then sort of like tweak those operations technologically. Yeah, I mean, you could think of all of this as sort of pointing in the direction of technology too, right? Because I mean, these civilizing projects are in a sense treating human beings as technologies to be worked upon. How do I make the perfect soldier, right? The soldier who operates sort of like clockwork? Well, via these disciplinary practices, right? I mean, these are sort of technologies for making better humans too. And so when Taylor was using a Greek word a lot in today's reading, poiesis. That means making. That's what the word means. And that's sort of what he's actually talking about in those contexts. We're thinking of ourselves as things that get made, almost like a machine, right? That we sort of make ourselves into the right kind of machine to handle the world. Now, there's going to be one thing about us that's not machine-like at all that we'll get to, but at least the lower parts of ourselves, we treat those as if they were a mere machine, particularly my body. My body is certainly a mere machine. And so I'm going to control and regulate it just like I control and regulate the clocks that I encounter or the clocks that I make in other kind of pursuits. All right. Good. Any other thoughts, questions with Lipsius? All right. One thing to just note, and for now I'm just going to note this. There's not really in any of this story any real place for actually worshiping God. Right? Like any sort of like worship of God doesn't really belong here because I'm too busy actively engaging in certain sort of practical projects, right? Like I've got a task from God, so how am I going to honor God by doing that task? But sort of like the kind of like devotional practices of worship, they don't obviously have a role. Now, it's not to say you couldn't still do those things too. We're not deists yet, right? But again, you can maybe see how the worshiping God part could start to seem like an unnecessary little addition, right? That all we need to do is just be the mechanics and, don't worry about anything else. Another thing to note here, all of this is presupposing the idea of the common good in all of this, right? That I'm not doing what I do for my good. I do what I do for the common collective good, which is also good for me, right? So it's not that I'm ignoring myself, but my action is oriented collectively. We're still within within the Christian tradition of agape or sort of like universal love, right? I'm not working per se for my benefit, even though I might be being benefited. I'm working for the benefit of my community, my nation, the whole world. And that's important. That's important to recognize, right? That this sort of collective sense of we're making the world a better place by doing all of this, that's a big part of what would motivate us to want to do all of this, right? Like, it's not just like I, for some weird reason, I'm seeing myself like a computer or whatever, right? Like, it's seeing myself this way is promoting the general good. And so I am doing my duty to take part in the general good in the course of doing it. The thing that astounds all of us, and as far as I can tell, people more or less believe what they're saying. I mean, there's some cognitive dissonance taking place, but like, even the people who are enslaving North and West Africans and murdering everyone that they can find in North and South America, they think they're making the world a better place for the people they're murdering and enslaving even. There's cognitive dissonance, right? Obviously, right? They're not paying attention, and there's some weird moments where they seem to sort of like know that what they're doing isn't really doing what they think they're doing. But there's other moments when all of these people talk as if they are making the world a better place by doing what they're doing. You see this with particularly in the context of Spain and South America, where in the ancient world, you just like conquered people, enslaved them, and your justification was sort of like, LOL, sucks to be you. Like, it was like nothing personal, just like, sucks to be you. Like, we were stronger than you, and guess what? Now you have to work for us. How life goes. Maybe someone will become stronger than us and enslave us, and it'll suck to be us, right? I mean, they didn't really feel much need to justify any of it. The Spanish and the Portuguese felt enormous need to justify how what they were doing was compatible with Christian doctrine. And what they were doing, again, was like enslaving and murdering people, to be clear, right? Like, so they felt enormous need. And so you get all of these really convoluted, complicated accounts of how and why this is a Christian thing to be doing. And it sort of fits in with this kind of neo-Stoics. It becomes the civilizing project. It's not merely lip service. It's crazier than that. Right? It's they really needed to give the justification to themselves, or they perhaps could not have lived with what they were doing. And that follows forth with all of these kinds of civilizing projects. For all of their violence, for all of the violence and the oppression, and even forget the colonial stuff just within your culture, right? When you're like literally beating the hell out of disobedient soldiers, you have to be doing it for their own good, right? And that's part of this ideal. So again, we can talk about specific excesses or whatever, right? But it's part of the ideal is that you're still being oriented toward the collective good in some way. So how are we doing? Is this making sense? Right. Weird thing, a couple other just weird little things to sort of start noticing here. This also is completely, everything that's being said here is completely incompatible with the idea that some people are gonna like are gonna do the, be operating at lower speeds, other people will be operating at higher speeds, right? This disciplining activity, right? Everyone needs to be disciplined in this way. And so if there are going to be lower classes, they now need to be a disciplined lower class, which is different than how anyone would have ever thought about it before. They need to be brought up to the same standards of discipline that we elites, we nobles are holding ourselves to. Of course, they fall short. That's why they're poor people, right? Or that's why they're peasants, is because they can't live up to our standards, but they need to live up to our standards, right? There's only one standard that everyone needs to live up to. Okay. Are we good here? All right, let's now see if you really adopt this, and you would be amazed at how wildly people are reading Lipsius. In part because of the military successes, actually, that our armies that were following his strategies had. They were indeed very successful armies. So that helps, right? Gives you a little practical street cred. But also intellectually, people are super into this and super into what he's doing. Let's start looking at sort of the philosophical, the kind of philosophy, the kind of self you're going to get if you start adopting this model of looking at the world. We'll use Descartes, like Taylor does, as our sort of exemplar of this, but we don't have to restrict ourselves to him. He's just an example. You don't have to be Cartesians, in other words, to be a neo-Stoic. But certainly, Descartes doesn't make sense without neo-Stoicism. That is sort of a background assumption. So let's start now defining this new self. What's the new self that we're going to get on this Neo-Stoic model? All right, so first thing, we are drawing a radical distinction within ourselves between different parts of ourselves. We're distinguishing different parts of ourselves. Now, this isn't new. Everyone throughout human history has said there's different parts of themselves, right? The ancients would divide us into our sort of desiring parts of ourselves and our rational parts. Within Christianity, you get the distinction, that distinction, and added to it is the heart. That's another part of ourselves, the heart of ourselves. So there's nothing new in positing different parts of ourselves here, but what are the new parts? Let's sort of take stock of what the parts of ourselves are. So first, I've got a body, right? A body that is purely a mechanism. And it's a mechanism to be controlled. I've also got a mind. Again, and so this is how we would get the sort of Cartesian mind-body dualism thing. This is the thing that's going to be doing the controlling. All right. So far, so good. I mean, so far, none of this might even be that new, anything that we've said, right? Like Augustine kind of says things that sound like this too. Maybe he wouldn't call the body a mechanism, but there's at least, like, Augustine says things that at least sound similar to this. Where things are going to get different, let's start talking about the parts of the mind, though. What's in my mind? Well, okay, one thing in my mind are passions and desires. These things, too, need to be controlled. They can't be ruling. Indeed, they have to have no part of ruling. They're the things that they are also, by their nature, disordered. All right. So what's going to be doing the ruling then? Well, it's got to be reason. Reason's going to have to be doing the ruling. Right. In some sense. But how is reason going to do this? The kind of reason that someone like Descartes has access to. Reason can, like, formulate beliefs, but it doesn't have any power. It doesn't do anything. Right? Reason just figures out what's true. Right? It doesn't move things. So what has to actually be doing the controlling? My will. Will is what has to actually be the one in control of everything. Now, will is sort of acting on behalf of reason, you could maybe say, or acting with reason. But nevertheless, will works to enforce what reason decides, both upon the rest of my mind, so will has to control the passions, and upon the body. How am I going to control myself? It's going to be via an act of will. What am I? I am a creature of will. Even more than I'm a creature of reason. I am a creature. The will and reason are connected, so it's, you don't want to separate these things too severely. But what I fundamentally am is a creature of will, of assertion, of control, of power. Right? I'm not a feeling thing. That's the thing that needs to be controlled, is all that feeling stuff. I'm not a thinking thing because the thinking thing can't control anything exactly. Again, there's a connection between reason and the will, but the reasoning part doesn't control anything in and of itself. I'm this willing thing, and I'm certainly not a body. Right? What I am is, in a very weird sense, because what is the will? In a very weird sense, what I am is the activity of trying to keep myself under control. That is what I identify with. That is my highest self. That's what I associate with, identify with, and try to strengthen with everything that I do. Yeah, you could. Someone's asking in the chat is whether or not reason is synonymous with wisdom. Synonymous might be overstating it, at least with what wisdom meant in the ancient world. In the ancient world, wisdom would be a part of what we're talking about as reason here, but related to it. Yeah, at least they're in the same register. Okay, if you are will, now we can really see how this is different from other forms of Stoicism. So in classic Stoicism, what you get when you become dispassionate is you get something they call contentment. And what contentment is this kind of state of just not being bothered by anything, being in harmony with everything. Right. What do you get in Neo-Stoicism? Well, it can't be harmony. Right? Precisely what you are is like a tyrant or something, right? Like you're constantly at war with yourself. This activity of trying to control yourself doesn't go away. It's not like you attain it. What you get is, we'll translate it in the modern English. We won't worry about what the word generosity means. So let's translate it in the normal English. What you get is pride. And pride at being victorious in the war to control yourself. Notice how different you're going to be if that's the highest thing. And again, no, we're not at Kant yet, but we're on the way to Kant. Again, on the way, but not there yet. Right? Here, the Stoic sage kind of doesn't even have a sense of themselves in the way that we're sort of talking down here, right? Like, what is the Stoic sage all about? The Stoic sage is sort of like all about like being at one with the world. They're not bothered by anything. They're not particularly striving to do anything, right? They just live, they just sort of let the world flow off their backs. They've given up a sense of themselves as actually something that would even like be concerned with things like pride or whatever. Here you almost get the exact opposite. You get a very strong sense of yourself. And not just that, but yourself as something that's awesome. At least if you've been successful, right? So at least if you are one of these nobles who's attained dispassionate rationality and all of that, right? You get a sense of yourself as something awesome, something great. Maybe in medieval Christianity, you had a sense of yourself as something like a depraved sinner or something, and maybe even Lutheran Calvinism actually. That's what you get, is a sense of yourself. You're particularly maybe, yeah, actually that might be more accurate to say that in like something like Calvinism, you also have a hyper awareness of yourself, but in Calvinism, it's a hyper awareness of your own like depravity. Right? Okay, well there you still definitely need God if you're aware of your own depravity. If what you're aware of is your own awesome, your own power, right? Because will and power, those two words go together. Say, for example, in Nietzsche's will to power, right? If you're aware of your own power, your own awesome, yeah. All of this is supposed to refer back to God, but you could start to forget that, right? Because you've got something to replace the role that God was playing, even in Calvinism and Lutheranism. There, Calvin and Luther, God is still playing the role of sort of like this like thing that's going to fix my depravity. All I have here is, hell, I'm pretty great. Look what I've done. Look at what I've controlled, what I've done to myself. And conversely, look how terrible everyone else who's not doing this is. So I also get to feel better than everyone else, too. What more could you want? I'm awesome and everyone else sucks. It's living the dream. Yeah, Magnus, go ahead.
So how is this a new philosophy of mind? Because it feels like it's just taken out of the Republic. And
good. Plato, yes, that's exactly right. There's a question in the chat that goes hand in hand with this. Is this where reason and intellect become the same thing? Yes, because what Plato is talking about in the Republic is a harmony. Reason precisely, and so look to it, whether we're talking about within the soul or within the city, right? It's not actually reason, the word is the logicon, so the thing that's the calculating thing, which actually fits with what Descartes is talking about here. That thing precisely doesn't rule as a tyrant, right? It rules persuasively. It persuades via other practices, because again, at least in the virtuous person, right? That virtuous person is also moderate. And what moderation, Plato says, is the passions listening to what the logicon decides is best. And thumos, or spiritedness, or whatever, right? That thing precisely listens. It doesn't try to rule. The sense here is that all of these other parts are intrinsically things that I'm going to have to war against. Everything else, everything else but will and reason, everything else but those two things is intrinsically disordered and can only ever be brought into order via constant effort, constant work.
So it's the same philosophy of mind framework. It's evaluated in a different way.
No, I think it really leads to actually a really radically different conception of philosophy of mind. Plato never says that reason can make you stop wanting things.
I mean, kind of, right? Because this just feels like the charioteer analogy, right? I mean, it feels like they play the exact same role as with the charioteer.
Yeah, no, I can see what you're saying. Yeah, so if we're leaving the Republic and we're going to the Phaedrus, I a little bit more see the connection. Okay, so let's do it in terms of there. So sure, yeah, like in Plato, like reason's always going to have to keep a firm hand on the reins, right? To some extent. But it's not so much still that it's not at war with the other horse. The other horse is still pulling in the right direction. It just does it a little. So, okay, let me, for people who are not familiar with the Phaedrus, which is probably most of you. So Plato gives this metaphor in the Phaedrus of the charioteer myth, where basically like you're supposed to sort of like how you get close to the good or to God or to the forms, however you want to put it, is you're sort of like reason is kind of like driving a chariot, and one of the horses that's sort of like passion kind of like is always kind of pulling in weird directions, right? It's always sort of like swerving all over the place a little bit, and that's why human beings go wrong. Human beings can go wrong because the passions can sort of like pull us in different directions and bad directions. But this is, I guess, the important thing there. Even that horse is still pointing in the right direction. It's just getting there badly, right? Like desire still ultimately is desire for the good in Plato. It's just doesn't understand the good, and so it frequently goes wrong in the course of trying to get there. Desire in Descartes isn't desire for anything. Desire in Descartes is a result of purely mechanistic forces within the body somehow interacting with the mind, right? It doesn't point to anything. In Plato, like this is a useful question, I think, because it is like, how is Plato not doing this? Is going to be super helpful if we can get clear. Plato thinks. So let's talk about sex. Let's use sex as an example. What are human beings doing, according to Plato, when they have sex? They are attempting in some small way to take part in the immortality and eternity of the divine. and why? How? Via reproduction, right? So human lives are short and animal lives in general are short. So when animals have sex and make little baby animals, what they're doing is they're extending their lifespan longer than it actually is. And so imitating in eternity to some extent. Now, Plato doesn't think that's the highest way humans can interact with eternity. There are better ways for humans to do this. But it's still pointing to the right thing, right? The question is just like getting it sort of on track. Desire in Descartes, sexual desire in Descartes is nothing to do with any of that. It's, in fact, it's like dirty and ugly and like the thing that most of all needs to be controlled is sexuality, because sexual drives will most of all sort of cause you to lose control. Right? There's nothing divine about it. There's nothing that points in the direction of divinity about it. That's a really different philosophy of mind. Everything in the ancient world, even if it's doing it at a lower level, again, these sort of like hierarchical scales, right? Even if it's doing it at a lower level, it's still imitating something divine. There's nothing divine about desire. There's nothing divine about the body, particularly, except that maybe that's a beautiful mechanism or something. Maybe it's divine in that way. But it doesn't reflect God in any sense. Descartes' really clear. What does it mean to say that we're made in the image of God? It's that we have free will and reason to some extent, but actually mostly free will. That's the only sense in which we are in God's image. And he actually says the only sense in which we're equal to God. Is it, insofar as we have a will, we're exactly the same as God. Insofar as we have reason, we're not like God. God's reason is way better than ours. But insofar as we have a will, we're exactly like God. God's will is, he basically says, is the exact same as our will, which sounds
okay, cool,
crazy from the Middle Ages, from a Plato or Middle Ages standpoint. But does that help, Magnus? Does that help with how this is a little different?
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense.
Awesome, good. Any others? Any other thoughts at this point? So okay, so what would someone like Plato? So there's a chat question. What would someone like Plato say about the connection between dopamine and serotonin and the experiencing of God in this way? So yeah, so Plato's not going to be a reductionist about the brain, as you sort of suggest in your question, Angelina. That's right. Like Plato's not going to be a reductionist about how the brain works exactly. But he's fine with saying that the brain has material components to it, right? Like the interesting thing for Plato is how does all that dopamine and serotonin and neurons and all the stuff, how does all of that come together to give rise to something that can participate in the eternal to some sense? And he's if you want to put it this way, he's more interested in the whole than the parts that it's made out of. So the human body is a miraculous whole that has a brain that can do things like think, and in so doing can participate in the divine in that regard. Whoa, how is that even possible? He's not going to be a reductionist. It's not going to reduce to the structure of the brain. It's going to be the result way in which those parts come together, and that's all about forms. That's all. In Plato, at least, that's all about the causality, formal causation, how forms cause matter to have certain properties. So I hope that was at least good enough. There's a lot more to say there. It's a good and important question, but that's probably at least enough for our purposes, at least hopefully. That's enough for our purposes. Right? Whereas, weird thing, Descartes, he's not a reductionist about the brain. Or maybe he's a reductionist about the brain. He's not a reductionist about the mind. That's why we have all this pride, right? We have this pride because we're a mind that can do this kind of ordering activity, right? But when the body sends signals to the brain that somehow end up as passions in the mind, all of that's pure mechanism, and all of that's beneath our dignity. All that's beneath our sort of worth or value. That's not what's cool. What's cool about us is this will thing that's not part of the mechanism in any sense. Good. Any more? All right. If we're good here, let's just continue to amplify it. This is just basically, we're just going to amplify this idea that we've been working with. Now let's deal with the social sense. If this is how I'm thinking of myself, how am I thinking of the community in the world? And this is what Taylor was calling the great disembedding. So now we're moving to that portion of the discussion. Right, so what is the great disembedding? Well, okay. First thing first, I can really conceive of myself as in some sense prior to and separate from the communities that I'm a part of. And why? Because I'm the mechanic that regulates those communities. So that's the first reason. I have the ability of seeing myself outside of it. But there's more. Also, all those others who are like me, these noble souls, they're my equals. And so I think of them not as members of a community, but as people who I am the same as and can form communities with. For those of you who are familiar with it, yes, I'm talking about social contract theory here. Social contract theory only makes sense if I am a neo-Stoic self. Because what is social contract theory? It is basically a whole bunch of people prior to a society coming together to organize a society. Moreover, my orientation toward God, insofar as I have one at all, is entirely personal. Entirely oriented toward becoming godlike myself. Rather than doing this as part of the community. The old sort of communal sense that like religion or Christianity or whatever is what we all do together. No. Christianity is something that I do and then kind of like do to the community. Weirdly, if I'm one of the elect, it's something that I do to my community. In fact, I Christian it, I order it. I see myself as self-made. Made by my will. And again, perhaps in conformity with the will of God in doing so. And so when I imagine my community, I am imagining a whole bunch of self-made people who have sort of voluntarily come together into a community and made that community in terms of their own principles, at least ideally. All right. My guess is the things that I just described, you have all heard before and to some extent all believe about yourself. Right. Taylor is 100% right. Everything that I just wrote on the board would literally have been inconceivable 2,000 years ago. Nothing I just wrote would have made any sense. How can you possibly be prior to your community? You were raised by your community. You speak the language of your community. You worship the gods of your community. The idea of a self-making literally was incoherent before this neo-Stoic self. No one would have thought of that way themselves in that way. Even So I won't go through all the history stuff that Taylor was talking about. I think it was, I hope it was relatively clear when he was going through like the sort of what I call the archaic communities versus the axial age stuff. If anyone has any questions about any of that, let me know. We can go over it a little bit. But I'm not going to go through all that history. But I think he's quite right that even though the axial age religious stuff pushes in this direction a smidge, it doesn't push toward in the direction of being self-made. Plato does not think of himself as self-made. He might think of the philosopher as in a sense outside of the city, but he also literally, like, or at least Socrates anyway, literally like dies for Athens. He doesn't think of himself as outside of it either, right? And similarly within Christianity, like you're both in the community and not in the community. So like maybe like you make yourself qua Christian, but you don't make yourself qua Roman. On this level that we're talking about here, I'm talking about making yourself qua like British or something, right? Or literally that the British made Britishness, that the individual people of Britain made what it is to be British by a kind of self-choice, self-creation, self-making. This idea of self-making is brand new. It does not exist anywhere in the world prior to this point, as far as I can see. There's some things maybe vaguely resemble it, but not quite to this extent. All right. This idea of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, this is literally the foundation of modernity. Modernity does not make sense if this idea is not possible. Now, this idea doesn't have to lead to atheism. It doesn't have to lead to exclusive humanism, as we see in our own time. Many of the people who most strongly endorse this claim of self-making in our own time are indeed Christians, right? But that's beside the point. You can't have any piece of modernity without this idea of self-making. It's going to give you a radically new way of thinking about Christianity. It's going to give you a radically new way about thinking about science. It's going to give you a radically new way of thinking about existentialism. For those of you, I know some of you at least are interested in existentialism here. Existentialism doesn't make sense unless you're a self-maker. Right? Nietzsche, not going to make sense unless you're a self-maker. Stuff that you all, I hope, think are really bad, like Nazism, National Socialism, doesn't make sense unless we are makers. National Socialism, too, is a self-made society. One we might think is very badly made in a very bad and dangerous way, but it, too, is a self-making. A society of making something. Okay. Previous to this, the goal would have been to live in harmony with the world. Now the goal is to make a world. And we're the makers. If that sounds like that was something that only God used to be doing, yeah, it is something that only God used to be doing. But like Descartes says, by will, we're not different from God. We're only different by God from the power that our will has to do stuff. But just in terms of will, we're the same as God. We're identical with God. All right. How is this? Is this? Are you getting a sense? Are you getting a sense of like how this is? How we're taking big steps to modernity here? If you think this, transcendence is going to be kind of a weird notion, or at least you're going to have to really. The kind of transcendence you're going to be able to accept is going to be super weird. If you're not thinking this, it's going to be hard to not think in terms of transcendence. And that's the story that I want us to start telling going forward. So the next thing is deism. What kind of religion can exist if we're Neo-Stoics? What kind of religion makes sense? What kind of Christianity makes sense? And the answer is going to be a deist one. And someone's asking in the chat, is will what I would say modernity most emphasizes? Yes. Will, the dominance of the will over reason and everything else is philosophically at least the distinguishing feature of modernity, I think. Yeah. It affects everything from ethics to epistemology to metaphysics to politics. The priority of the will. And that being what we are. We are will to power. All right. So it's time for me to let you all go for the day. So I'll definitely do that. Thank you all very much. I'm happy to stick around, chat about anything. Anyone wants to stick around and chat a little bit longer. yeah, otherwise, have a wonderful weekend. We'll start with deism next time, and I look forward to at least seeing those of you who I will be seeing very soon. I'll be looking forward to it. It's gonna be fun.
Hi, Professor.
Hey, Ajay, how you doing?
Good, how are you?
Doing all right.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk, if that's okay, a little bit more about that question that I asked in the chat.
Mhm.
Like, it's really like hard, obviously, to talk about it in a relationship to Plato because neurochemistry didn't exist and like people didn't talk about dopamine connection, dopamine and neurotransmitters with everything and stuff.
Right.
But like, he takes like based on what I understood, he just takes a more broad and like whole oriented approach,
Yeah.
and like he would never like do reductionism or stuff like that.
That's right. Yeah, it's because he has a really different understanding of causality than someone who's going to go in the neurochemistry direction. And while Plato didn't talk about neurochemistry, he did actually talk about sort of like psychology, we could loosely say. So in the Phaedo, this Phaedo is where this comes up. So in the Phaedo, Plato says that okay, you could have someone who thinks that the reason that I'm here, why am I sitting here right now? And you could say, well, it's because of your bones and sinews. So kind of reductionist answer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was the cause. But he's like, but that's crazy if you say that though, because, and this is the context of Socrates. So Socrates is the one who's talking. He's like, because if I believed that I should escape from jail, because he's in jail, this is right when he's about to be executed. If I believed that I should escape, then those bones and sinews would be somewhere really far away, right? The reason I'm here can't be because of the bones and sinews. The reason I'm here is because I thought it was best to be here. And if I thought it was best to be somewhere else, those bones and sinews would have taken me somewhere else.
Right. So like it's more like, I guess like I would interpret it as behaviorism.
Okay, so maybe, so it's still a little bit different from behaviorism, though. Like closer, it's closer to something like behaviorism than it is reductionism. I think Plato would still subject to behaviorism almost as still being too reductionistic, because like in behaviorism, at least in classical behaviorism, right? Again, it's sort of this like mechanistic process where like certain stimuli produce certain behaviors or something. And he's going to want to say, again, fine, but like what matters is almost like the significance that those stimuli have, right? Like that's why, like, so the classic so this is I don't remember his name, but someone gives this as a classic rejection of behaviorism. If behaviorism is true, why do humans sometimes like write letters backwards when they're writing a word out, right? It's like the same stimulus shouldn't have produced the same output every single time, right?
Yeah. Okay.
And like it seems like it's not exactly a mechanized process. It's a process of meaning and significance. And that's more the direction where Plato is going, where like what your brain does, so bones, with those bones and sinews, what those neurotransmitters and neurons and like what all of those things are doing is creating something, a whole, like you were saying, sort of a holism, a kind of a whole in which meaning happens in a way that it doesn't happen in a clock, and it doesn't happen for maybe a plant, and maybe it doesn't even happen in my dog, right? Meaning forms happen in all of those places, to be clear, but it happens in humans in a different way that couldn't happen without my brain. Stab me or whatever. It's gonna, my ability to do all that's gonna go away. He says like the bones and sinews are that without which all this stuff wouldn't happen, but they don't answer the cause question. What answers the cause question is the whole.
Right. Like so, like would a metaphor be accurate? Like that, like bones and sinews would be like sort of like book cover and pages, and then the meaning would be like what's the message and concepts.
Yeah, if you want to do this in terms of like, so if you, yeah, exactly. So what explains the novel is the novel. You don't have a novel unless you have all the words, right? But the words only mean something in the context of the novel as a whole.
Right.
And a little bit, like, so then we can make it even stronger. That's true for the person writing the novel too, right? The person who's writing the novel, they didn't have in mind the individual words. They wrote the words that they wrote because of the whole. The whole that at this point was just an idea in their mind or something, or a glimpse inside of their mind. And so, like, for the later Neoplatonists, what they'll point to as a metaphor here is actually the human body. So what comes first within the human body? The whole body or the parts of the body? Weirdly, the whole.
Yeah.
Weirdly, the whole comes before the parts, right? Like, they wouldn't have gone to this level of detail, but we can do with modern science, right? I was one single organism, a partless thing, way before I had organs, right? Way before I had bones and sinews, right? The whole was already contained. Now, via modern biology, would say via DNA or whatever, right? The DNA molecule. That sort of is the idea of the book, right? That's already contained, and then all of the parts of the whole are generated to give life to that idea. That's a metaphor, but yeah, it's a metaphor, but the kind of metaphor for what Plato's talking about here.
Kind of like the oversimplified idea that like the whole is different than the sum of its parts.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the kind of causality that he works from is where always like the whole, in a sense, is what actually causes the part. The parts to be the parts that they are.
Yeah, not the other way around.
Yeah. Whereas the reductionist is going to go the other way. The reductionist will always go the other way with it. Right.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. I have one more question.
What?
Do you know of like any like intellectual, I mean, philosophers or psychologists who are more like modern, right? Who talk about like neuroscience and neurotransmitters, but also like derive some of the like larger concepts from like Plato, or like those ideas of like forms and beauty and stuff.
Right. So off the top of my head, at least, I don't know anyone who's specifically doing Plato for that.
Okay.
I will say within continental philosophy, some of the later phenomenologists are going in some of those directions, at least. Like Merleau-Ponty is very aware of psychology and neurobiology. He's older, he's 50s and 60s. And I think Deleuze similarly. Deleuze is more directly engaged with Plato, though his relationship with Plato is a little bit more complicated. But he's also very directly engaging with natural science too. And he's at least definitely not going to be a reductionist at the very least, even if he's not a full Platonist or whatever.
How do you spell Deleuze?
I'll write it up on the. Let me confirm that that's right. I'm not even 100% sure that that's right, but. I actually haven't done much work on Deleuze myself. He's one of the more. Yeah, I'm missing an E.
2 E's.
No, yeah, Deleuze there. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I see.
He's a super important, probably the most important of the more recent continental philosophers. I don't know his stuff super well. I haven't. When I was in graduate school, his stuff was only just starting to get translated into English. So I'm not super. But I know, but like he's doing a lot of really interesting things where like he's not in any sense rejecting modern science, but he wants to really hard push against the kind of reductionist trend in a lot of it.
Okay. Oh wow, interesting. Yeah, I never heard of him. That's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Gotta get the.
Okay,
Have a
bye.
great weekend.
You too.